just going to say a few words myself by way of introduction, both about the two authors and just a few remarks about the topic, the intersecting topics that their books deal with. Lou Uchitelle is probably known to many of you if, like me, you're a daily reader of the New York Times, because for 25 years he wrote for the Times on work and labor issues. You may not know that prior to that, he did reporting in Latin America for many years for the AP. And he's also the author of a previous book that attracted quite a lot of attention, maybe some of you know it, called The Disposable American, which came out in 2006, and as the title suggests, is about layoffs and their, both blue and white collar layoffs, and their many ripple effects. So that's just a short bio for Lou. And Joshua Freeman, my colleague here at Murphy, and also a distinguished professor of history at the CUNY Graduate Center and at Queens College, and lucky for me, a good friend, is a distinguished labor historian who's written many different things, and I'm just going to hit a few of the high points. His first book, which is called In Transit, and you might guess from the title, published in 1989, is the definitive study of the Transit Workers Union here in New York. He was also among the co-authors of the widely used labor history textbook series that some of you may know, Who Built America. Probably his best-known book, at least so far, I predict this one may rise even higher, is his 2000 book called Working Class New York, published by the New Press, and we use it as a textbook in this building, and I know many of you will be familiar with it. And then he published yet another book in 2012 called American Empire, and finally we have the book you're going to hear about tonight. So let me just say a little bit of background about the two books before you hear from the authors. I seem to have lost my second sheet of notes. Here it is. So both these books, as you probably know already, focus on manufacturing, not only in the US, but in both cases globally. And both see this sector as highly significant, although for somewhat different reasons. Both also recognize, as I'm sure everyone in this room does, that the modern labor movement was born in the factory, and that historically, and that the desire to undermine unions is a key driver of capital mobility and outsourcing. So that they have in common, but otherwise their understanding of manufacturing, and in Josh's case it's not really manufacturing but the large factory, from kind of different perspectives, and they draw somewhat different conclusions from their analyses. So I just want to say a little bit about that before you hear from them. So Lou's book, as you'll hear, emphasizes the central role of government subsidies to capital in making manufacturing a viable activity, not just here in the US again, but worldwide. A recent example of that you're all familiar with, I think, is the auto bailout right after the 2008 meltdown. But there are many other examples. Think of all the state and local concessions routinely proffered to attract investment in manufacturing and actually other industries too, Amazon nowadays. So his book is sort of a plea for those subsidies being the basis of what used to be called industrial policy, a term he uses but which you don't hear very much nowadays. It was more common in the 80s. Some countries, he shows us, still have industrial policy meaning government policy that's designed to maximize the benefits of manufacturing industry in a given country. Germany and China, he points out, still do a lot of that, and he calls for the US to do more of it. He points out that the bleeding of manufacturing jobs in this country has been quite dramatic. I think maybe you know these numbers, but he reports that in the most recent year that we have numbers for, factory employment was 8% of total civilian employment in the United States, down from 38% in 1944, which is the peak, and 22% as recently as 1979. And he's really concerned about the erosion of those jobs, and especially the high wage, which I read as unionized manufacturing jobs via outsourcing and other things, and the effect of that on non-college educated workers, which is actually also discussed extensively in his earlier book that I mentioned. So this is what industrial policy could address, but he also argues that manufacturing is vital to economic well-being, more generally, for a country and for the people who live in it. So that's just a preview, but I want to just compare that a little bit to Josh's perspective, which is a little different. So he also examines the role of the state, of government, but not in relation to subsidies or industrial policy, but actually more the coercive role of the state in ensuring an adequate labor supply for the earliest factories, and actually recent ones too, In England, you may know that, as he documents in detail, factories relied on orphan children from workhouses, among other sources of coerced labor, not to mention slavery, which supplied the raw cotton for that industry. And he also documents state repression responding to strikes and other kinds of worker uprisings. Like Lou, Josh also sees factories as a source of immense wealth and innovation and of rising living standards for the societies in which they take root, but also as sites of intense oppression and environmental destruction. So it's a somewhat different perspective. As he writes at the end of the book, quote, "The giant factory has made dreams reality, but it has rendered nightmares real too." So he doesn't really have the nostalgia for factory jobs that Lou's book, at least as I read it, has. He also demonstrates the centrality of the factory in the iconography of modern societies, from architecture to the visual arts to photography, film, and also as the center of social critique and left-wing intellectual thought, from Marx and Engels themselves to Gramsci to Trotsky to Mao, and on and on. And he recounts the history for us of factories as tourist attractions. Ordinary people, as well as artists and intellectuals, were captured by their imaginations were captured by the grandeur of large factories, not just here in the United States, but in many other countries. And the book roves around the world to the Soviet Union, Poland. The Soviet Union factory fetishism is the subject of a whole chapter. And perhaps that's the ultimate example of industrial policy in Lou's terms. But we can talk about that. China is an exception. Its supersized factories are completely inaccessible to the public for all kinds of reasons that maybe you'll hear about later. So the key point, though, that I want to leave you with is that Josh does not share the nostalgia for blue-collar jobs that is featured in Lou's book and maybe in some of your minds, even though he maybe has a little nostalgia for the grandiose architecture and the iconic representations of it in large factories. He also points out that U.S. manufacturing employment is at a low point, citing the same 8% figure I mentioned before, but notes that worldwide manufacturing still looms large, accounting for almost a third, 30% of the global labor force, and 43% of the labor force in China. So I'm just going to end with one point, which is that that's all true, and yet, if we measure manufacturing in a different way as a percentage of gross national product, it's actually been steadily declining, not just in the US, but worldwide, even in China, for quite a few decades. And I believe this will continue as productivity continues to rise in manufacturing, just as occurred in agriculture a century ago. So I myself don't think this is such a bad thing. Factory jobs are not much fun. You all know this. We should restore the high wages and union protections associated with factory jobs in the past, in this country and elsewhere. But the jobs themselves, not so much, at least in my view. Anyway, that's my 2 cents, and with that, let me turn it over to the authors. So the game plan is this. They're going to each talk for about 15 minutes, and I will be the fascist timekeeper here. And then we'll open it up to all of you, but we'll leave some time. We'll try to stop around 7:30 so there's time for refreshments and book sales and book signings, if you're so inclined. Okay, so we didn't talk about who wants to go first. Who wants to go first? You do? Okay, fine. So Joshua Freeman.
That's strictly a chronological issue. I start earlier. I would like to very much thank the Murphy Institute for putting on this event, especially Paul LeFin, who really made this thing happen. And it's a particular pleasure for me to speak about this book here because the very first iteration of it was a little like brown bag talk I gave 5 years ago to my colleagues at lunchtime in this building on the 19th floor. And that eventually morphed into the book that came out a couple weeks ago. What got me to that lunchtime talk, what started me thinking about this, were events in China in 2010. And that year, there was a rash of suicides at a firm that, at that point, I had never heard of, Foxconn, which was a Taiwanese electronics assembly firm with many factories in China. And in 2010, 18 workers between the ages of 17 and 25 attempted suicide, 14 successfully, mostly by jumping off the roofs of the factories or the factory dormitories in which they lived. And this, of course, is a very startling story in and of itself, but what I think helped bring it to worldwide attention was the fact that this occurred in factories that were assembling iPhones and what was a brand new product, the iPad, which were kind of symbols of modernity and the good life. And the juxtaposition of these young Chinese workers jumping off the roofs of these buildings that were making these sort of shiny, perfect Apple objects for about 45 seconds grabbed the world's attention and grabbed my attention, and I started reading about the factories. And the first thing that struck me was the absolute staggering size of these Foxconn factories. Several of them had more than 250,000 workers in single factory complexes, which made these, as far as I can tell, the largest factory workforces in single factory complexes in history. And as I soon discovered, this was not utterly unique, that there were and are quite a few factories in China and also in Vietnam, primarily electronics assembly factories and footwear factories that have 100,000, 150,000, 200,000 workers, and even more. So this was extraordinary to me, and I started thinking about it. And it occurred to me that although these places were unmatched historically in terms of their absolute size, they really were not without precedent. Ever since the first factories appeared some 300 years ago, there have been in each era factories that have stood out because of their technical innovations, their sheer size, their social centrality, and have become objects of great interest at their own time. So Behemoth, my recently published book, tells the story of these landmark factories and tries sort of through them to tell the broader story of the history of the factory and the making of the modern world. I begin the book with what I think of anyway as the first factories, and everyone defines this slightly differently, which were the textile mills in England in the 18th and 19th century. The first ones constructed to make silk thread and then to make cotton thread and cotton cloth. And then I followed the story of the factory as it jumps across the Atlantic to New England and to Lowell, Massachusetts, where a factory system developed that was seen as a sort of positive alternative to what famously William Blake called the dark satanic mills of England. And so, I then go through a series of cases moving sort of forward chronologically to the iron and steel industry, which is a more complex industry, ups the scale, and becomes the site, at least in the United States, of fierce battles between workers and factory owners that sort of gives lie to this notion that Lowell had sort of planted, that you could bring the factory to the New World without the class conflict that it had brought in England and elsewhere in Europe. The book then turns to the Ford Motor Company and the introduction of what we call mass production techniques, including the assembly line, which radically lowered the cost of complex consumer goods like cars and refrigerators and things like that, again upping factory scale, culminating in the Ford River Rouge factory, which was the largest factory that ever operated in the United States. And I spent quite a bit of time talking about that. I then jump oceans once again to the Soviet Union, as Ruth mentioned, to the story of how actually US companies and skilled workers and engineers and architects provide assistance to the Soviet Union in the late 1920s when the country goes on a crash industrialization program. So it brings a kind of an American template of the giant factory to the Soviet Union, which then, after World War II, in turn, spreads it to the newly socialist countries of Eastern Europe and of China. And it's ironic because as that's happening in the United States itself, factories begin to shrink as the model of the giant integrated factory begins to be abandoned by American corporations because of the success of American workers in using these as choke points to win unionization and tremendous transformation in what factory life meant to the people who worked in. And then finally, I end where I began this talk, back in China. So this is a long and complicated story, and I could not possibly tell it all tonight. And if you do want to hear it all, you're going to have to get the book to do that. For which apparently we'll have the opportunity shortly. But I thought what I would do is just try to point out some of the themes. I mean, I think by looking at these cases that go across time and space, certain patterns began to emerge, and I'd just like to talk about a few of them. Today we live in a factory-made world. I mean, everything just about in this room and in my pockets and my clothes and you name it, the stuff that we use for shelter and clothing and food and medicine and transportation comes from factories. Yet Americans pay extraordinarily little attention to the places that make the stuff that make our lives possible. We have come to take what I would call factory-made modernity for granted, almost as if it's a kind of natural fact of life. But of course, it's anything but that. And that was understood in earlier generations. Factories, and especially the kind of largest, the most technically advanced ones, were once objects of great wonder. And all kinds of people, journalists, novelists, social scientists, parliamentarians, trade union activists, engineers, management theorists, tried to sort of grapple with what they meant and what the consequences were. The very first factory I write about, which was a silk mill built in Derby, England in 1721, set a pattern, Ruth alluded to this, of the idea of sort of factory tourism. People come to see this new thing under the sun, and it's a sort of surprising group of people. One of the first visitors was Daniel Defoe, who I would never have thought about in that connection. James Boswell goes to visit the factory. Same thing in the New England cotton mills. The New England, Lowell, Massachusetts was a stop on the tour of the wonders of the New World. You go to Niagara Falls, you go to New York City, you go to Lowell, Massachusetts. And people from Charles Dickens to Alex de Tocqueville go there. American politicians go there. I loved it when I discovered that Davy Crockett toured the, you have to be a certain generation. Davy Crockett, to me, the coonskin cap, what's he doing in Lowell, Massachusetts? But, he's a member of the House of Representatives, and he goes, President Andrew Jackson goes. This is an amazing thing. And in the 20th century, we still see this, especially in the kind of great documentarians and photographers and painters, both in the United States and in Europe, people like Charles Sheeler and Diego Rivera and Charlie Chaplin, and the list goes on and on. And I think part of what was so fascinating to them is that they thought of factories as ushering in a new world. They recognized the revolutionary nature of the factory, which not only is capable of producing goods and quantities and prices unprecedented, but requires a kind of transformation of the society around it, and even the inner workings of the people inside it for the factory to operate. And I think it's this that draws so many people to try to figure out what this thing is. There's often a kind of utopianism associated with these factories. In England, in the United States, in the Soviet Union, but there were also dystopian fears, as Ruth alluded to. And the relationship of these two, the relationship of both the promise and the ills of the factory, was once a much debated question. There's a wonderful quote from Thomas Carlyle, again, someone you wouldn't think necessarily wrote about this, who says, "Cotton spinning is the clothing of the naked in its results, the triumph of man over matter in its means. Soot and despair are not the essence of it. They are divisible from it." So, for some, the kind of Promethean triumph of the factory can be cleansed of its ills, of its abuses, and it's a path to a new world. Of course, Marx and Engels also thought that. They saw the factory as both the most advanced form of exploitation, but also something with great liberatory potential. Engels wrote, "Precisely the quality of large-scale industry which in present society produces all misery is the very quality under which a different social organization will destroy that same misery." These questions are very rarely debated today. The production process is no longer a central problematic for most people in our society. Unlike in the past when landmark factories were celebrated and visited, today they're hidden behind fences or across oceans. They're out of the spotlight far away. And the celebration that once occurred of the factory, and again, Ruth mentioned this, transcended capitalism alone. I think I came to this project like a lot of people thinking of the factory as the capitalist institution, a stage of capitalist history. But I quickly realized that you can't think of the factory as simply a capitalist institution. Of its 300 years of history, 100 years it's been both communist and capitalist places. And one of the fascinating stories to me is what happens when you take the American template or the capitalist template factory and put it in a very different kind of social setting. And there certainly are changes, but not as much as you might expect, not fundamental changes. And it is remarkable to me how much the factory has proved kind of impervious to changes from its surrounding environment, and how few and far between have been experiments at a fundamentally alternative system of production. The large factory has been both durable and not durable. Individual factories don't last that long. The Derby Silk Mill lasts 169 years, but that's an outlier. Typically, they last a lifetime or two. What makes this system survive for 300 years is that it keeps reproducing itself. In any one spot, the very dynamism of modernity that creates the factory ultimately unseats it. In the initial phases, these new factories often take advantage of groups previously outside of the labor market: children, apprentices, prisoners, nomads, peasants, and have very high profits because those folks have no rights, they have no mobility, they have no alternative. But over time, the combination of labor activism, reformers, and the high fixed capital that makes the owners and managers of these places kind of conservative means that new alternatives pop up, and eventually a cheaper, more efficient, lower cost factory drives the original one out. And the factory then migrates around the world. And we're seeing this playing out today. Americans complain the Chinese are taking our jobs, but many of the factories that were pioneering in southern China in foreign-owned manufacturing today are beginning to move themselves either to central parts of China or lower-cost places. One of my favorite discoveries was that the Chinese company that makes the shoes for Ivanka Trump's shoe line has now opened a factory in Addis Ababa where they are transferring the production of Trump shoes. So the cycle continues. Some people think that the age of the factory maybe is over as automation takes charge. As Ruth pointed out, in the US, certainly we've seen a tremendous decrease in the percentage of the workforce that's involved in manufacturing, but worldwide, that's not the case. And I think we need to be cautious before we move to ideas like guaranteed basic income and other programs that see our central problem of the future as joblessness. Maybe, but after, it's been 60 years since American sociologists, so this is Ruth's fault, have declared, us living in a post-industrial society, and I don't quite see that having come yet. What is true, though, is that if you're one of those places where the factory's been and moved on, often, instead of having the kind of expansive, even utopian vision that is associated with the arrival of the factory, the departure is associated with social malaise and sort of shriveled imagination. The Industrial Revolution and the giant factory leave in their wake a belief in a teleology of progress and techno-determinism, but for many, the future is already come and gone, perhaps leaving them with sneakers and a smartphone, but with little hope or belief of the ability to create a new world, which is exactly, of course, what the factory did. So as I write in my conclusion, the giant factory demonstrated in practical, concrete ways the ability of humankind to exert mastery over nature, at least for a while, in the process vastly improving the standard of living for billions of people, but also despoiling the earth. It illuminated the deep ties between coercion and freedom, exploitation and material advance. It revealed the beauty to be found not only in the natural world, but in the man-made world, in labor and in its products, and demonstrated the deep yearning of working people for control over their lives and a degree of justice. But to me, perhaps, particularly at this moment, the most important lesson of the giant factory, the history of the giant factory, is the one that it seems to me it's the easiest to forget. And that is that it's possible to reinvent the world. It's been done before, and it can be done once again. Thank you.
Okay, and now Lou Uchitelle with a different perspective on a similar topic.
Let me say that first off, I'm sitting here with the authors of two excellent books, probably more than two excellent books, but I quote Ruth Milkman in my book, Making It Why Manufacturing Still Matters, and I would have quoted this author, Josh Freeman, if his book, and I would have done it with gusto, if his book had existed when I wrote mine. My book is not so much a history of manufacturing as an argument, a reporter's findings. And when I say I would have quoted Josh, I see in his book a sort of Will Chamberlain of figure, and I'm sort of glad to see. I was looking at reading the book, looking at his photo in the jacket cover, and thinking to myself, this man must be 7 feet tall, the more I read, and it was a great relief to find that he isn't 7 feet tall, and that we can talk to each other. Over the years as an economics writer for the New York Times, and that particular beat was covered 20 years, I gradually realized from visits to factories and conversations at meetings of the National Association of Manufacturers, they invited me to those meetings until they decided they didn't care all that much for some of the stuff I wrote. And I began slowly to realize that I could not find a factory or a factory owner running an operation that wasn't subsidized. And I don't say that pejoratively. I don't think that's bad. Subsidy isn't the right word even. Every factory owner that I've ever talked to, and I've talked to a lot, and no one denies it, is a beneficiary of public money. And if that's the case, we should have not the haphazard system we now have for feeding money to manufacturers, but a national industrial policy. Trump isn't going to, I didn't vote for Trump, and I don't want you to think that I'm presenting Trump's point of view, but he touches on it, and in touching on it, he gets votes, and he gets a false strength. Let me cite St. Louis, which is where my mother comes from. My grandfather settled. One of my brothers lives there. Was mayor of Clayton for a couple of terms. General Motors. I have a chapter in my book on urban manufacturing. It's built around St. Louis. One of the stories has to do with General Motors, which had a multi-story factory in that city, and it moved that factory to Wentzville, about 80 miles away. Now, GM already had a much more modern plant in Wentzville. There was a lot of space where it could go from multi-story to a more efficient single-story wing. What's more, the GM employees in St. Louis, North St. Louis, were offered transfers to GM plants anywhere in the country, and a number of them took those transfers. But North St. Louis is an African-American neighborhood, or much of it is, and the next and it was a good place for high school educated young people, in this case African-Americans, to come out of school and join the assembly lines of factories such as General Motors. That's not going to happen anymore. The current generation gets transferred, the next generation, and it's already, you can already see it happen, they get jobs, but driving ambulances, doing service sector work, ambulances, because that's St. Louis is a medical center, and you find that they are earning in those jobs $10, $15, $20 an hour less than what they might have earned if General Motors and Emerson Electric had kept their factories in St. Louis. That's because you have to remember a concept of value added. Value added means that if you take a sheet of steel that's worth $100 and bend it into a fender that's worth $150, that's $50 of value added. Now, a lot of that goes to overhead, to all sorts of things, but there's a big chunk of money there that if the factory is unionized, that goes to workers. Absent the factories, those same workers, and I work as I say, in service sector jobs, the value added isn't anywhere near as great, and therefore the potential for the potential for high wages isn't there, assuming the workers are unionized. And I'm not thinking, I didn't just think this up myself. Visiting St. Louis, I stayed with my brother, so I made a number of visits there. I interviewed African-American ministers, and they explained to me essentially what I'm explaining to you right now. And so I said, why don't you protest? And they don't seem to be able to get a protest going. But they are people, but they are aware of what's been lost. And they are aware that while the unemployment rate in St. Louis is low, there's a lot of people who are working at $10 or $15 an hour less than what they could have made in the factories, and there's a huge amount of dropping out. The labor force participation rate in this country, not just St. Louis, has dropped by 3 or 4 or 5 percentage points. I had that number in my head before I got up here, but I can't seem to remember it right now. That means that people are no longer working or looking for work. They've gotten discouraged, or they're living in households where one person is working or 2 people and 3 or 4 others aren't. And it's a problem. There's a discouragement out there that I run into, every time I visit the Midwest, I run into it all the time. There's another, situation going on that's sort of representative. And manufacturing's contribution to the gross domestic product was nearly $2 trillion last year. That was roughly 10% of the nation's entire GDP of about $20 trillion. Within manufacturing, within that $2 trillion, $200 billion was spent on the manufacture of weapons and other materiel for the armed forces. That's 10% of what our factories produce in the United States, and it's sold to the Defense Department. And if you go outside now and take a look at the police cars, you'll find that most of them are also assembled in America. So we've got between our security, our city, the weaponry that's made in factories is a big share of what manufacturing is in this country. I find that disturbing, to say the least. I mean, it's a lot of weaponry sold to the police. For that matter, if you go out and take a look at the sanitation trucks picking up sanitation, they are also assembled in America because of Buy America clauses in state government. We're dependent on government for a lot of to purchase a lot of the output of our manufacturing, and the government emphasizes the purchase of weapons. And that might help to explain Trump a little bit. I don't know if it does or not. He seems to be saying that he'll revive things. I don't know what to. I'm not even going to try to explain Trump. If I do, I'll get in over my head. But one point is clear. We have substituted military demand for civilian demand when it comes to factory output in the United States. I overstate the case when I say that, but not by a lot. I guess I will insert Trump a little bit. My wife, reading over my notes, and she's here in the audience, said, these people are going to ask me about Trump and his proposed tariffs, and you better have something to say. So I should ask my wife to come up here and finish this talk. Well, in 2014, just 4 years ago, we were rebuilding the Verrazano Bridge, and there was a dust-up over the use of steel plates manufactured in China. And just to show you how attitudes can change, at the time, it was 2014, a gentleman named Tom Pendergast, the chairman of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, lamented the absence of American-made steel plates. He would have been glad to buy them, but he also lamented, and I quote him directly, the absence of domestic steel fabricators capable of satisfying the requirements for a project of this scope and complexity. He was saying that the Chinese steel industry is better than ours. And perhaps it is. 3 concluding thoughts. Manufacturing employment, is that? Okay, maybe I'll have more than 3 concluding. I have 5 minutes. Well, I was so busy trying to tighten the speech. Manufacturing employment is not likely to be all that big a deal, not when factory production is increasingly automated. And that's not bad. I mean, factory production is automated. I've gone to any number of factories that make complex products, even trucks, and the line is heavily automated. So you need fewer and fewer people. And not surprisingly, manufacturing employment is down from 19 million in 1979. That was the post-war peak, to 12 million or so today. And that doesn't include temporary agency temp workers who are hired by factories and put on the assembly line for less money than if they had been just ordinary hires. That 12 million is up just 2 or 3 million in recent years. It's not a lot. And I would repeat this, the big drop since 1979 from 19 million then down to less than 12 million and now back up to 12 million is not likely to be reversed. Manufacturing is not going to be a source of employment. Reshoring is also problematic. There's a lot of people out there saying, get these manufacturers to bring their production home. I found that reshoring was mostly practiced by companies with factories abroad that produce merchandise entirely for sale within the United States. Subsidies lured them home. That's fine for a bunch of companies. It's not a lot, though. Most of the problem is that most of the manufacturing in America, 2/3 of it, according to my research and the help I got from various other researchers, the problem is that multinationals account for 2/3 of factory production in the United States. Starting in the 1980s, rather than export, they put more and more factories abroad, mainly to serve overseas markets. Those people aren't coming home. They get subsidies overseas, they get all sorts of good things. General Motors, a company that we bailed out several years ago, makes north of 1 million, assembles north of 1 million cars a year in China. And I've yet to see even Trump, and neither Obama nor Trump, I've never yet seen an American president get up and say, we've got to export car. We got to assemble those cars here and export them to China. It just doesn't happen. There is no good reason why GM should be assembling in China more than 1 million vehicles a year for sale in that market. As I say, they make a lot. They're one of the biggest car makers in China. At least some of those cars should be made here and shipped there. And I don't hear Trump saying a word about that. I didn't hear Obama really saying much about it either. What can we do to push that issue? Well, we could rebuild the union movement. How, I don't know, but we could. If I get a second edition of my book, which was published in May, I'm going to write an introduction that deals with the destruction, really, of unions as a pillar of this society. And I would say that Cesar Chavez is the model, that if we run into companies, multinationals that are making, like GM, making north of 1 million cars a year in China, if we run into to GM, to that sort of situation, there should be the same thing that happened with Cesar Chavez and the grape workers. I would also say that perhaps it would help if these multinationals, which, as I say, account for 2/3 of the production in this country, not to mention what goes on overseas, if every one of these people had a union, 2 or 3 union members on the board, and that takes place in Germany, and it should here. I would also bar private equity firms from owning stakes in manufacturing companies. The goal is not efficiency. And again, in St. Louis, there was a factory that had a couple of plants, made parts for autos, actually. It was taken over by a private equity firm, which made it much more efficient, closed one of the plants, piled the debt for the acquisition onto the books of the company, so that this private equity firm not only bought the manufacturer, but shut down one of the factories and then loaded the debt onto the company. All right, I thought maybe you were clapping for me to sit down. Give me 2 seconds more. All right, well, it used to be that, again, I would say one of the cars I owned before, the 2 or 3 cars back, had in it, there was more pride in manufacturing here. One of the cars had in it, made by union workers, it was a Ford, and there was identification. This car was assembled here in the United States. You don't see that anywhere anymore. And I would also say we've got all this public money flowing into manufacturing. It often comes in, this is my last point, it often comes in the form of one city competing against another city to get a factory in that city. That should be ruled out. There should be a recognition that public money is a big part of manufacturing, and then a national industrial policy that's aimed at increasing the amount of output rather than getting the factory to go to St. Louis instead of Kansas City. If we don't do that, we will eventually, and I won't go into this now, but we will eventually find ourselves with a currency that collapses on us. And that's for next year. Thank you very much.
Okay, now it's your turn. So I will call on people. We have a pretty big crowd here, so I'm going to ask everyone to first identify yourself very briefly and keep your comments and questions brief so everybody has a chance. We'll start with you. Is there a microphone running around here somewhere? It's coming. Maybe you can use this one in the meantime. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your two talks. If we were sitting in South Korea or Japan, I think we'd have a different outlook on these things. Having been to those two countries, we see kind of what my colleague here, John Rinn, has called an industrial ecosystem, where different companies and suppliers and automation and the universities, they're all working in concert. In this country, it seems there's a kind of a intellectual or philosophical deficit to think about how we can reshape these capacities, because we do need manufacturing to make windmills and subway cars and the kinds of things that Seymour Melman talked about. So I'm wondering who can provide this vision, and maybe we have to think about a kind of political innovation that will allow us to link this vision to this capacities that we need to develop. And if somebody could say something about Mondragon, that might help, because that is a more utopian vision of what a manufacturing capacity could be. Thank you.
Mondragon is the Spanish cooperative system some of you may know about. I think that question is for Lou, basically.
I'm not sure how to answer it, but I would say that a national industrial policy would decide where money should go, and the goal would be to increase value added and output in this country, whether it creates employment or not. I would say what?
Hold it closer to your mouth. Yeah.
All right, I
That's
would
better. Yeah.
add one other point here. Right now, we are importing many more products than we export. We pay for those products in dollars. The Chinese or whoever, any country you want has to take those dollars and do something with them. They cannot buy an equivalent amount of factory output in this country, so they invested, after all, in American government paper. After all, the dollar is the international currency, and they therefore, just as the pound was until we displaced the British between the two world wars. Well, the day is going to come when the Chinese say, or the Asians, or a combination of countries is going to say, we're not going to buy any more American securities. And that's going to cost us we're not going to be able to say that we have the international currency. That international currency is going to mean that we're going to have that collapse of the dollar as the international currency, or the slow erosion of it, means that we will have to make more in this country. And I don't know whether we can at that point or not.
Yes. Yes.
I'd like to ask both speakers. Walter Daum, retired from City College. There's a debate going on as to whether the loss of manufacturing jobs is due primarily to offshoring or outsourcing on the one hand versus automation on the other hand, and I'm curious what the speakers have to say about that.
Okay. Do you want to start, Josh? Yeah.
Well, it's certainly both. I think in terms of sheer numbers, probably more. Look, I don't know how you measure it. In sheer number, it looks like it's automation, but that's sort of tricky because mostly it's not companies just leaving. It's also whole new industries arising other places. And some of these industries are not very automated. I mean, Foxconn. If you go to a factory that makes smartphones, some of it looks very sophisticated, and a lot of it is incredibly primitive. You have people sitting on little workstations putting little things together. That's not particularly automated. So I think there's no one answer. They're both factors, and companies are making decisions not on some principle, they're on very pragmatic issues. How can they make money? And in some cases, moving to low-wage areas provides a good solution for them, and other places automating provides a better solution. So I think we're seeing both of them, and they sort of feed into each other.
I would agree with what Josh says, but also say that over the years visiting factories, Navistar, for example, I found automation in given factories increase. The thrust is toward more automation and less manpower. And I don't think that can be, we can increase output and maybe even increase employment. But we hit a peak after World War II in 1979 of 19 million. We're now down about 12 million. Actually, we dropped to 10 million, and we're not going to go a lot higher than that. It should not, manufacturing should not be thought of as a solution for employment. I would much prefer to build 2 or 3 high-speed rail lines across the country. That would be a much better source of employment, even if that has to be done with deficit spending.
Let's try this side of the room for a change. Maureen, how about, yes, Gabe?
Hi, Gabriel Winan. I'm the books editor at New Labor Forum. I have a question about what comes after the factory. And Lou, you alluded to how in St. Louis, as in many post-industrial cities, people are driving ambulances, you said, in the healthcare sector in particular, quite commonly now is by far the largest sector of employment, which also depends on public procurement, right? That Medicare and Medicaid, and historically, collectively bargained Blue Cross Blue Shield, built that industry. And so I'm curious why industrial policy is something that has to only happen in manufacturing, and whether we can conceive of the institutions of the welfare state that have driven a tremendous amount of employment in these newer low-wage sectors as also potentially a tool of industrial policy.
I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, but you're wondering why we can't have, well, I think all the health care work and all that work is fine. I wish the healthcare workers were organized in unions that could shut down the health care in order to get wage increases. We lack a functioning union movement at this moment. But I do think that I think urban manufacturing in urban centers is a very important means of dealing with the African American community, which is heavily located in those places. I can cite Cincinnati, which once had 5 factories downtown, P&G, I should say, 5 factories, and they drew heavily on the vocational high schools. Those factories are all gone from downtown Cincinnati, and so are the vocational schools. There's one left out in the suburbs. So and it leaves people, I'm drifting a bit, but it leaves a lot of people unemployed, lost, if you will.
Let me just sort of free associate 2 quick comments, which are not a comprehensive answer. But one is, I think it's important when we talk about factories leaving the United States, it's not as if they're leaving the United States economy. So, for example, Foxconn, it was created by this sort of charismatic Taiwanese businessman named Terry Gu, right? And he's the biggest single shareholder. But, who's the second biggest shareholder? It's Vanguard, right? And if you look at all these companies, like the world's biggest sneaker maker, which is also Taiwanese, and then you look at who and that's again owned by a sort of Taiwanese capital group. But then you look at the second, the third, and the fourth biggest, investors, and the U.S., often funds or hedge funds or mutual fund companies. So, when we think about why there is or isn't industrial policy, it's not as if powerful interests, in the United States are not deeply involved and implicated in this ongoing evolution of the factory system. So, I think that's something that carefully keep in mind. The other thing I would say is that, you picked a relatively positive image of post-industrialism, but, if you look at like Lodz, Poland or Detroit, it's kind of pathetic when people try to somehow convince themselves that these little cultural things that happen because you could buy a house for $3 because no one, lives there anymore is somehow a renewal of these cities. It's not. These places are not being renewed with, there's Pittsburgh, but Pittsburgh's, is the exception. Then there's every place else. So, this leaves real deep wreckage, in the, whether it's the Ruhr Valley or Detroit or northern China. And I think recovering from that is not going to be so easy as just sticking a hospital in there.
Let's go over here. Microphone. And please identify yourself also.
Thank you. Marty DeCat. Josh, you finished your talk saying we can reinvent the world. The implication is that there's something different, some different kind of form of, I won't use the word factory, some different kind of form of making things. Would you free associate on that?
Nope, I will not. All I can say is, I'm in 1720, and I don't know that 1721 is around the corner, And then suddenly, if you lived in northern England in 1720, there would not be in your imagination that this thing was about to arrive. And one of the things I talk about in my book that's so fascinating is it doesn't arrive like as a little infant. It arrives almost fully formed. Like this first silk mills, 300 workers. You look at it, you go, that's a factory. So the process of social invention is mysterious to me, and I don't know the answer to that. I am struck at how few efforts and how unsuccessful they have been largely to like the arts and crafts movement or some of the Maoist experiments to come up with mass production systems. In other words, that can provide large quantities of things, drugs, clothes. But I don't think that means we can't do it. We're an extraordinarily inventive species, and yeah, I think that can happen. But would I venture a bet as to what that's going to look like? Not me.
I'll put in a little bit of 2 cents.
No, please go ahead.
I wrote 2 books, one about, and I've written, of course, a lot for the New York Times, but there's a common theme that I ran into, and it's acquiescence. We acquiesced to the idea that factories could close and go. We acquiesced to layoffs, and we shouldn't have. We should have had labor yelling and screaming every time GM or anyone else closed a factory and moved the production overseas. And we didn't do that. And now we're acquiescing to the idea that we don't have to be that much, well, we're acquiescing to the movement of manufacturing out of urban centers where African Americans, as my particular interest, live and can't get jobs, and there's no uprising about it. One of the big problems, and of course the multinationals could not close factories in this country and put the production overseas without acquiescence on our part, without a Cesar Chavez type of public resistance, and yet that is essentially what's going on.
Len.
Hi, Len Rodberg. When you learn the history of the Industrial Revolution, it sounds like you're taught it as if it's sort of an Anglo-Saxon project. Take England and New England, and that's it. I mean, do you have anything to say about what was going on in Germany, for instance, or France or Italy? I mean, they're very industrial, and especially the Germans, it would have thought wouldn't be very backwards in that.
Yeah, I mean, I pick case studies, and you're absolutely right. They're a little bit inclined to the Anglo-American world, partially because of language, but partially because I think there is something of a progression of a particular model of industry that I try to follow. I mean, there's certainly precursors. I mean, the first English silk mills sort of steal the technology from the northern Italians, actually, and sort of Bologna, where they get the technology. But as I get into the 20th century, I do sort of try to make some comparative studies. I do have some stuff on Germany, and part of it, and this is such a nerdy piece, I didn't even talk about it, is, part of this book is about why are these factories so big, which is, to me, actually quite mysterious and something I'm very interested in, and why, for example, is Volkswagen got 70,000 people now at their main plant, and the River Rouge has less than 6,000, And I do try to talk about that. And do some comparative looks at why the model changes in different kinds of social settings. And one of the things I try to argue, and I do look at post-communist countries too, is that, America has a particular history because of the intensity of class struggle here, actually, and that the model is not techno-determined. It really is determined from, can companies be confident that this, what they think of as, in technical terms, is the most efficient model, these big integrated, complexes, can you make sure that no one's going to take it over, basically? And in post-World War II America, companies thought, no, we can't be sure of that. Whereas in Germany, for one reason, they could be sure of it, which is co-determination and social democratic policies, and the Soviet Union and China, for other reasons, they could be sure of it. So I do try to look comparatively at how different sort of social situations shape the actual logistical organization. I still talk about some post-World War II Soviet factories, which I don't know, the United States, who knew that they had, truck factories with 110,000 people in the Soviet Union? Why are they so large? And so some of that.
Yes. You.
Thank you. Judy Richhammer. To the extent that we still have industrial unions, are they addressing the working conditions within the factory? I mean, not just, their first mission has to be wages and benefits, I'm sure, but are they looking to protect the bodies of the workers in that factory, and to what extent are they successful? And I imagine they are more successful in addressing that issue in Europe, in Western Europe, than they are here.
I'll take a quick shot. I mean, there are a lot of unions all over the world, and they vary in their success. And by the way, there are lots of worker activity in China too that tries to address these. I would say in the United States, some unions do a pretty good job at that, and the laws that we have tend to only be meaningful in unionized situations. OSHA doesn't work unless you have a union, even though in theory it equally applies. But I want to reinforce something that Lou said. Where I think unions have not been successful at all is to intervene in the issue of where investment goes. So, inside the existing plant, they have more or less power, but shaping the political economy, and this is not a required subject of collective bargaining, and the whole legal and ideological system in the United States is inclined against that role for unions, and the few times unions have tried to do that, they have been pretty unsuccessful. They've been kind of shut down. So I think, in that sense, they're at the mercy of these larger forces, which ultimately undermine the conditions in any individual plant.
I think that's right. I would add one thing. Doug Frazier was the last union person that I know of that banged his fist, and I think he got onto the board of directors of Chrysler. And I would say that the only way we're going to get unions to exert their influence is to have them help to run the factories on the board, on the corporate boards of the companies that own the factories. That goes on in Germany. It does not go on here. GM should not be allowed to operate without union members on the board of directors. And union members, by their nature, would vote against making cars in China for the Chinese. They couldn't stop it, but they do everything they could to push more exports, more stuff made here, less there. As for safety, I think that's the role of the federal government, of government agencies, to enforce normal safety rules.
Oh, wow, we have a lot of people who want to talk. Let's start with you.
Thank you. By the way, I'm enjoying reading your book, and what I sort of sense from reading economic history is that you can see that up until about the 60s, everyone sort of assumed that manufacturing was very important, that it was undergirded national power, that it was important for the economy. And over the last few decades, that sense has really sort of disappeared from the political scene. And now we see sort of the antagonism almost between the working class and the professional class. The professional class knows more about the deep sea water events in the Atlantic Ocean than about factories. You know, it's sort of a problem. So what would you ascribe that lack of importance of manufacturing to, or if you could speculate?
Well, I would say that after World War II and into the early 50s, manufacturing value added was from manufacturing was about 29% of total value added in the country. That's been on since then on a steady decline with a couple of upward bumps, but essentially a steady decline to about 12% today. And that's a huge loss. And a big percentage of that, and a big part of that production is, if we had that sort of 30%, 20, I mean, China is north of 30%, South Korea is north of 30%. The very container ships that we started making that now are used to bring all this manufactured goods to this country, they're made in South Korea and some of them in Europe. We used to make them in New Orleans, or I don't know about the container ships. We might have lost the industry before the container ships came in. The bottom line is manufacturing is not a big enough share of the economy. While it has been declining from 29% to 12% or less, finance has gone from about 10% up to, I don't know, 20%, something like that. And the service sector also.
Yeah, I just add two things to what Lou said. You know, one is Steve Fraser was here earlier. He wrote a book called The Age of Acquiescence. It compared the two Gilded Ages. And he kind of argues that the first Gilded Age is about sort of capital accumulation. But, you know, since 1975, a lot of money has been made in the United States by disaccumulation, you know, and the rise of finance, as Lou says, you know, brings with it a kind of cultural reorientation. You know, in the book, I write something like how, I'm just agreeing with your question, you know, through the 1950s or 60s, it was a sort of given in many countries that you had to have a steel industry to be a kind of fully sovereign, modern state, which is one of the reasons why there's so much overcapacity in steel, because, you know, all kinds of countries subsidize it. And then we sort of stop believing it. But lo and behold, on March 2nd, our president tweeted, our steel industry is in bad shape. If you don't have steel, you don't have a country, which, you know, the man shows his age. What can I say? You know, he's the last believer in this, but I guess maybe I agree with him.
Okay, we're going to have two more questions, so I'm going to call on Michael and then the woman with the scarf. Yeah. And we'll have plenty of time for informal conversation afterward. Michael first. Does somebody have a mic?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Maureen.
I got it. Okay.
I'm Michael Hirsch. I want to take partial exception to something Lou said. You used the phrase acquiescence. I mean, biography tells different stories depending on who you're talking about. In my case, I was a steel worker in the late 70s going into the 80s. I was one of those intellectuals who gave up an academic career to industrialize. And after 5 years, I was laid off, went back to graduate school. That's a whole other story. I worked for the U.S. Steel, which was a giant plant of 30,000 people. It's now 5,000. It's still open, producing almost as much steel as it did with 30,000 people. The threat that we faced was not from foreign steel. The threat we faced was from steel mills moving to the south. It was the same problem that textiles had 30 years earlier, or 20 years earlier. Automation has something to do with it, but politics had much more to do with it. The acquiescence part, I think you're right about. We were all offered something called trade, I forget what the R stands for. TRA, which meant we got a year's worth of pay to shut the fuck up, is what happened. And we all took it. And in my case, I became active with what was then the Citizens Party at full salary to be an organizer. In retrospect, that was a bad deal because TRA had nothing to do with unfair trade relations. Had nothing to do with our jobs. It was a calculated move on the part of U.S. Steel to search for profits elsewhere. It also had to do with automation to some degree. Some of the procedures we did were not replicated in the South. I don't think acquiescence is the right explanation, unless you want to say that it was the ruling elite that acquiesced. We certainly didn't acquiesce. We were beaten back. I also wanted to raise a small point with Josh. I don't know whether it's fair to suggest that the Soviet Union went through the same thing because that proves necessarily that there's a certain structure that's implied in industrialism. It was a devastated country. It had to industrialize, and the only model it had was the West. It says nothing about socialism, and I'm very surprised that you talk about it as a socialist system. There was nothing socialist about that system. That's a fight you and I can have privately. I'm not raising it here. I mean, that's just...
Let me just
Go
make
ahead.
one comment on this. What we've done is we've told people they have to go to college, and we've shut down the vocational high schools. So you're telling people that they have to do something that they're at fault. It's not the state, it's not the industry, it's them. They don't have the right education. Cincinnati had 5 vocational high schools in it when I first started visiting that city, and the African-American ministers, one of them in particular, who was the leader of a council there, said, if we didn't have these vocational high schools, our kids wouldn't go to school, because there's many of them that don't want to go to academic high schools. We've shut down vocational high schools across the country. And we've told people that they have to go to college, that's the route. And I think that's a terrible thing to have to tell people who. The percentage of people who go to college hasn't changed that much over the last generation.
Actually, that's not true. It's gone up quite a bit. But
It has?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I thought that the percentage, it's gone up quite
it
a
has,
bit.
yeah.
All right.
So a lot of people don't finish, but the percentage who attend college has gone way up. Yeah.
All right.
Did you want to comment on this, Josh, or you want to wait for? You'll do it privately. All right. So the last word goes to the young woman over there whose name I don't know. Could
Hi.
you tell us who you are?
Micaela Skognic. I am a historic preservation student at Pratt. There's a lot of talking about how there's a convergence between new communications and new infrastructure regarding renewables and all of that. Since the nature of work is changing, I think it's interesting to note, for instance, what happened with this solar panel factory that opened in a former steel mill, Republic Steel Mill site, I believe, in Buffalo last year. And I'm wondering if there is, for you guys, there is any interest in that kind of trend, or if you're completely skeptical about if this kind of direction can benefit urban manufacturing.
Let me try to answer it on 2 levels. One is, on the level of, do I think it's a good idea to encourage manufacturing that's related to renewable energy? Absolutely. Do I think we should have subsidies the way almost every other country has for that kind of industry? Absolutely. But let me just be maybe a pedantic historian here for a second. What do we mean when we say the nature of work is changing? I think the changes we're seeing are so minor compared to the changes that came with the rise of the factory. I mean, people in those factories are still arriving all together at a certain time, and they're all leaving at a certain time, and they're all going to the bathroom when they have the permission to go to the bathroom, and they're all eating lunch at the same time, and they're all having a divorce in the physical location of work and home. These are all things that just seem natural to us. That's the way we live our lives. And yet these were recent inventions. You know, these are inventions of just a few hundred years ago, when people's internal time sense, the notion of what work was, its relationship to the family, to all the other aspects of life were radically transformed. And in this sense, I think not that much has changed. You know, you see a picture of workers in a factory with 100,000 people making sneakers. And what are they doing? They're sitting at individual workbenches gluing together these parts. It's not changed at all. You know, you look at a Bangladesh clothing factory, and it could have been on Ludlow Street, you know, 100 years ago. So, yes, we are automating. Yes, we have some new products. But is the basic paradigm changed? I don't think so. I really don't.
Do you want the last word, Lou, or?
Well, I will say that I think he's right, that the basic paradigm hasn't changed, but the trend is towards more automation, not less. And as far as people are concerned, the trend is to go to college, not just stop with high school. And you used to be able to stop with high school and feel that you could make a decent living.
At least that creates jobs for some of us. Well, on that note, let me thank you all for coming. And